The most dangerous monster isn't the one lurking in the shadows. It's the one standing beside you in the sunlight, smiling. That is the fundamental, terrifying lesson of Theodore Robert Bundy. To understand how he became a specter in the American psyche, you must first understand the world he exploited, an America of the 1970s. A nation built on a foundation of trust, unlocked doors, and the inherent belief in the goodness of a handsome face. My name is Dr. Evelyn Reed. For years, I have analyzed the Bundy case not by looking at the monster he became, but by dissecting the perfect man he pretended to be, because his charm was not a personality trait. It was a meticulously crafted weapon. Consider the man in 1974. On the surface, he was the American dream personified, a handsome, charismatic law student at the University of Utah, a rising star in the Republican Party, working on a governor's re-election campaign. He was the kind of man you'd be proud to introduce to your parents, articulate, intelligent, and unfailingly polite. Friends and colleagues described him in glowing terms. He was the kind of son every mother wanted, the kind of boyfriend every father would approve of. He was, by all accounts, completely and utterly normal, safe. But beneath this placid surface, a quiet dread was beginning to spread across the Pacific Northwest. In Washington, then Utah, young women began to disappear. They were all remarkably similar, bright, beautiful, with long, dark hair parted in the middle. They vanished not from dark alleyways, but from college campuses, from sunlit parks, from their own neighborhoods in the middle of the day. The police were baffled. There were no signs of a struggle, no credible witnesses who saw anything violent or out of the ordinary. It was as if these women had simply ceased to exist, plucked from the world by an invisible hand. In an era before forensic science became what it is today, investigators were left with a terrifying paradox. How could these vibrant, careful young women, surrounded by people, simply vanish into thin air? The answer was unimaginable, because the truth was hiding behind a smile everyone was taught to trust. They weren't looking for a monster. They were looking for a man who looked just like Ted Bundy. To truly grasp the effectiveness of this weapon, we must first step back and look at the battlefield itself, the America of the 1970s. It was a nation in transition, caught between the fading idealism of the 60s and a future paranoia that had not yet taken hold. Hitchhiking was still a common mode of travel. People were taught to be polite, to trust authority, and most importantly, to help those in need. This social contract, this unspoken set of rules based on assumed goodwill, was the fertile ground in which Bundy planted the seeds of his deception. He didn't have to break the rules of society. He simply had to master them. My analysis of Bundy's life before his capture reveals a man not hiding from the world, but actively embedding himself within its most trusted institutions. Consider his work at a Seattle suicide crisis hotline. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally good at his job. He was empathetic, calm, a reassuring voice in the darkest hours for hundreds of strangers. He saved lives. This wasn't just a cover. It was a rehearsal. He was studying vulnerability, learning the precise language of trust and desperation from the people who called him for help. His political aspirations were another layer of this elaborate camouflage. As a volunteer for a prominent Republican governor, he surrounded himself with power, ambition, and the polished veneer of civic duty. He was seen, he was respected. He was the clean-cut, intelligent young man who was going places. He was building a character so believable, so antithetical to the monster within, that to suspect him would seem not just wrong, but absurd. This is the core of his method. He understood that society has a collective imagination, and a serial killer did not fit the image of a well-spoken, handsome law student. We create archetypes, the creepy loner, the wild-eyed drifter. Bundy was none of those. He was the hero from a different story, who had wandered into a horror film, and no one knew how to react. In the mountains of police interviews and witness statements I've reviewed, the same refrain echoes through the decades. I remember one transcript from his long-term girlfriend, a woman who lived with him, who loved him, during the very period he was committing these atrocities. Her words are a chilling testament to the power of his mask. Interviewer: were there ever any signs? Anything that made you suspect? Girlfriend, voice trembling: suspect Ted? That's like suspecting the sun won't rise. He was my rock. When my daughter was sick, he was there. When I was struggling, he was the one telling me I was strong. He was gentle. He was kind. The idea that Ted could hurt anyone, it wasn't just unbelievable. It was impossible. It broke the laws of the universe as I knew them. This is the paradox that paralyzed investigators. The evidence of Bundy's public life screamed his innocence. Every person who knew him became an unwitting alibi, a character witness for a man they never truly met. They weren't lying. They were simply describing the character he had so masterfully played for them. And so, my initial hypothesis began to form, not on a single piece of evidence, but on the overwhelming weight of its absence. The killer wasn't leaving no clues because he was a ghost. He was leaving no clues because he moved through the world under a perfect disguise, the disguise of being a good man. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was hiding in our assumptions, in our politeness, in our reflexive desire to trust a handsome face and a helping hand. He had created a social invisibility cloak, woven from the very fabric of the society he sought to destroy. For months, this cloak of social invisibility seemed impenetrable. Bundy moved from city to city, leaving a trail of missing persons posters and grieving families. Yet he remained a phantom. The theory of a charming, intelligent killer was just that, a theory. What investigators desperately needed was a crack in the facade. They needed a witness. They found one on November 8, 1974, in a shopping mall in Murray, Utah. Her name was Carol DaRonch. She was just 18 years old, a young woman living an ordinary life, completely unaware that she had wandered into a predator's hunting ground. She was browsing in a bookstore when a handsome, well-dressed man approached her. He wasn't threatening. He was concerned. He spoke with an air of authority that commanded respect. He told her he was a police officer. The interaction that followed is perhaps the single most important piece of evidence in understanding Bundy's methodology. It was the moment his weaponized charm was caught on camera, figuratively speaking. In my sessions analyzing her testimony, the dialogue she recalled reveals a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Bundy as Officer Roseland. "Excuse me, ma'am. I'm Officer Roseland with the Murray Police Department. We've had a report that someone attempted to break into your vehicle in the parking lot." Carol DaRonch. "My car? My Volkswagen? Are you sure?" Bundy as Officer Roseland. "Yes, ma'am. We've apprehended the suspect, but we need you to come down to the station to file a complaint. I can give you a ride." Notice the technique. He isn't asking. He is directing. He has created a problem, a threat to her safety, and immediately presented himself as the solution. He is not a stranger asking for a favor. He is an authority figure performing his duty. He is exploiting one of the most deeply ingrained social rules we have. Trust a police officer. Carol, though hesitant, ultimately complied. It was the logical, responsible thing to do. She walked with him out of the bustling safety of the mall and into the growing twilight of the parking lot. It was only when she was inside his car, a light-colored Volkswagen Beetle, that the first red flags began to scream. The inside door handle on the passenger side was missing. He didn't drive towards the police station. When she questioned him, the polite concern in his voice vanished, replaced by something cold and flat. He pulled over in a quiet area, and in one swift, terrifying motion he snapped a handcuff onto her wrist. The trap was sprung. The mask had fallen. The man in the car was no longer a charming law student or a helpful police officer. As Carol fought for her life, kicking and screaming, he uttered the simple, brutal truth that lay beneath all the layers of deception. "I'm going to kill you." But Carol DaRonch broke his pattern. She was not passive. She fought back with a ferocity he did not expect, managing to get her door open and tumble out onto the street, running into the headlights of an oncoming car. She escaped. Her survival was more than a miracle. It was a turning point. For the first time, police had a detailed, credible description of the man behind the disappearances. But more importantly, her story provided the first concrete proof of his method. The charm was not just about his looks. It was about his ability to skillfully impersonate the very people we are conditioned to trust. He weaponized our sense of safety against us. Carol DaRonch's harrowing escape provided the first tangible crack in Ted Bundy's perfect facade. He had made his first major mistake. He had let someone live to tell the tale, and in doing so, he had given the world the first real clue to dismantling the deadly rule he had so perfectly crafted. Carol DaRonch's survival was a seismic event for the investigation. It provided a name, a face, and a method. Police across multiple states were now hunting for a phantom in a Volkswagen who impersonated police officers. But this crucial lead, as important as it was, created its own form of tunnel vision. They were looking for a man who used a badge to gain trust. They soon discovered, to their horror, that the man with the badge was just one of his characters. Ted Bundy had another far more insidious method of attack, one that didn't rely on authority but on its polar opposite, vulnerability. As I delved deeper into the case files, cross-referencing witness statements from different states, a disturbing new pattern began to emerge. It was a pattern based not on intimidation but on pity. This led me to formulate what I consider to be the central pillar of his entire predatory career. I call it the rule of assumed benevolence. It is an unspoken social law, a deeply programmed instinct that compels us to help those who appear harmless and in distress. It is in essence our own empathy weaponized against us. Bundy understood this rule better than anyone. He didn't just exploit it. He reverse-engineered it to become the most efficient hunting tool imaginable. The most terrifying exhibition of this rule in action took place on a beautiful, sun-drenched summer afternoon, July 14, 1974, at Lake Sammamish State Park near Seattle. The park was crowded with thousands of people, families and friends enjoying the perfect weather. It was the last place on Earth anyone would expect a predator to strike. It was, however, the perfect hunting ground for Ted Bundy. He arrived not as a monster, but as a man in need. Witnesses would later describe a handsome, charming young man with his arm in a fake sling, struggling to load a sailboat onto his car. He would approach young women one after another, with a polite, slightly embarrassed smile. The dialogue, reconstructed from multiple witness accounts, was a masterpiece of non-threatening manipulation. Bundy, as Ted: "Excuse me, I hate to bother you. This is so embarrassing. I'm having a bit of trouble getting my sailboat onto the trailer with my arm like this. Would you mind just giving me a hand for a minute? Think about this request. It is brilliant in its simplicity. It's a small, finite task. It presents him as injured and therefore non-threatening. And most powerfully, it triggers our instinct to be helpful. To refuse would feel rude, even cruel. Many women he approached that day politely declined, citing other plans. Bundy's reaction to refusal was key. He would simply smile, thank them, and move on. There was no anger, no pressure. He was fishing, patiently casting his line again and again, knowing that eventually, the rule of assumed benevolence would land him a catch. His first victim that day was Janice Ott, a bright young social worker. She was seen helping the charming man with the injured arm walk towards his car. She was never seen alive again, but Bundy wasn't finished. He was arrogant, emboldened by his success. Hours later, in the same crowded park, he used the exact same story. This time, the victim was Denise Naslund, a young woman who had been enjoying the day with her friends and her dog. She, too, walked away willingly with the handsome stranger who just needed a little help. This is the core of the horror at Lake Sammamish. These women were not dragged into the shadows. They were not abducted by force from a dark alley. They were lured away in broad daylight in front of thousands of people because their killer understood a fundamental truth about human nature. It is often harder to say no to a request for help than it is to fight off a direct threat. A threat triggers our adrenaline, our fight-or-flight response. A plea for help bypasses those defenses entirely and appeals directly to our empathy. The police were searching for a single man, but they were chasing a phantom with multiple faces. One moment he was an authority figure demanding compliance. The next he was an injured victim begging for assistance. He was a social chameleon, a human void who could perfectly mirror the expectations of his chosen target, making himself whatever he needed to be to get them alone. This wasn't just a series of crimes. It was a horrifying psychological experiment, and the American public were his unwilling test subjects. But even the most careful phantom leaves a footprint. For all his meticulous planning and psychological manipulation, Ted Bundy's downfall began not with a brilliant piece of detective work, but with a simple, routine traffic stop in the quiet suburban streets of Granger, Utah. It happened in the early hours of August 16, 1975. A lone patrol car driven by Officer Bob Hayward noticed a familiar light-colored Volkswagen Beetle cruising slowly through a residential neighborhood, its headlights off. It was suspicious enough to warrant a look. When Hayward flicked on his lights, Bundy made a critical error born of pure panic. He fled. The brief high-speed chase ended when Bundy finally pulled over. The mask of the charming, confident Ted was gone, replaced by the cornered, desperate animal underneath. But as Officer Hayward approached the vehicle, the mask was hastily put back in place. Bundy was calm, polite, almost apologetic. He was just a law student lost trying to find his way. He deployed his usual tools of disarming charm, but this time they were failing. Hayward was a trained, skeptical police officer, and something felt profoundly wrong. It was when Hayward's flashlight beam cut through the darkness of the passenger side floor that the abstract horror of Ted Bundy became terrifyingly concrete. There inside the car of this polite, well-spoken law student was an inventory of nightmares. A crowbar, a box of large green trash bags, an ice pick, a pair of handcuffs, rope, and most chillingly of all, a pantyhose stocking with eye holes cut out, a crudely made mask. This was the moment of truth. Bundy was no longer a suspect in a series of disappearances. He was a man caught red-handed with a predator's toolkit. Any normal person would have been broken by this discovery. But Ted Bundy was not a normal person. It was in this moment that his profound pathological arrogance was laid bare. He did not confess. He did not panic. He performed. His explanations for the items, when he was later questioned, are a masterclass in narcissistic rationalization. He believed so completely in his own power of persuasion that he thought he could talk his way out of anything, even this. Detective's voice. "So, Ted, explain the handcuffs." Bundy's voice. Calm, almost bored. "Oh, those. I worked as a campus security guard for a while. Bought them then. Just never got around to getting rid of them." Detective's voice. "And the crowbar?" Bundy's voice. "My car's old. Sometimes the battery cable comes loose. I use it to pry it off. Basic car maintenance." Detective's voice. "The mask, Ted. Explain the pantyhose mask." Bundy's voice. A slight condescending chuckle. "It's Utah. It gets cold in the winter. It's a ski mask." Individually, each explanation was just plausible enough to be considered. A ski mask for the cold, a crowbar for car trouble. But together they painted an undeniable, horrifying picture. Bundy's arrogance was his blind spot. He was so confident in his psychological rule, so certain that his charm and intelligence could create a reality more believable than the physical evidence, that he couldn't see how utterly damning it all was. He believed his story was more powerful than the truth. He was about to find out he was wrong. The discovery of this kill kit was the first physical, undeniable evidence that connected the charming law student to the phantom predator. It was the beginning of the end for his cloak of invisibility. The police now had more than just a description. They had the tools of his trade, and for the first time they were no longer just investigating a series of missing persons cases. They were building a cage for a monster they could finally see. With the discovery of the kill kit, the abstract phantom police had been chasing for years was finally given a name and a face. But capturing Ted Bundy was one thing. Breaking him was another entirely. When he was brought into the sterile, fluorescent-lit interrogation rooms, detectives expected one of two things: a vehement denial or a broken confession. They were prepared for anger, for tears, for silence. They were not prepared for what they got: a calm, intellectual debate. This is where the true psychological battle began. Inside that small, claustrophobic room, Bundy was not a cornered suspect fighting for his freedom. He was a performer on a new stage, and his audience was the very men who sought to imprison him. He deployed his rule of assumed benevolence but adapted it for a new, more skeptical audience. He couldn't charm them into pity or trust, so he tried to charm them with his intellect. He attempted to reposition himself not as a suspect but as a peer, an expert, a consultant. The primary interrogator, Detective Bob Keppel, was a sharp, no-nonsense investigator. He came armed with facts and evidence. Bundy came armed with misdirection and narcissism. The transcripts of their early interviews are a chilling portrait of a psychopath at work. A chess match where one player is trying to win the game, while the other is trying to convince everyone it's not a game at all. Detective Keppel, voice calm, factual. "We found handcuffs in your car, Ted. We found a mask. We have a witness, Carol DaRonch, who positively identified you. She says you put a handcuff on her." Bundy's voice, unemotional, almost academic. "It's a fascinating situation, isn't it? From a criminological perspective. You have a series of crimes with a very specific victimology. The perpetrator is clearly intelligent, organized. What do you suppose his motivation is? What drives a person like that? Do you see the technique? Keppel presents an accusation. Bundy responds not with a defense, but with a question. He elevates the conversation from a specific crime to a theoretical discussion. He is attempting to shift the power dynamic, to move from the suspect's chair to the professor's lectern. He is inviting the detectives to join him in a detached intellectual exercise. It was a brilliant, unnerving tactic. Throughout hours of questioning, he never wavered from this strategy. He spoke about the crimes in the third person, creating a fictional perpetrator he could analyze from a safe distance. He was, in essence, trying to profile himself, controlling the narrative by pretending to help solve it. The most audacious moment came when Keppel, frustrated, tried to appeal to any shred of humanity Bundy might have. Detective Keppel. These girls are gone, Ted. Their families deserve to know what happened. We're not talking about theory. We're talking about real people. Bundy's voice. A long pause, then softer, more thoughtful. This individual you're looking for. He isn't a monster. People want to believe that. It's easier. But he's a man who has been consumed by something. A force, an entity. To understand what he did, you have to understand what possesses him. Perhaps if I had a better understanding of the evidence you have, I could offer some insight. Help you understand how a person like this thinks. This was his masterstroke. He was offering to help the police get inside the mind of the killer. It was an act of supreme arrogance, a calculated gamble, that they would be so intrigued by his expertise that they would momentarily forget he was their only suspect. He was applying his rule directly to law enforcement. He was presenting himself as a helpful, intelligent man and counting on their professional curiosity to override their suspicion. For the detectives in that room, it was a profoundly unsettling experience. They were used to criminals who lied, who stonewalled, who confessed. They had never encountered one who offered to co-author the investigation. Bundy did not break. He did not confess. He simply tried to turn his own interrogation into a seminar on his own twisted psyche. He failed, of course. The evidence was too strong. But in those hours, in that small room, he gave them a terrifying glimpse into the true nature of his monstrosity. It wasn't just in the violence he committed, but in his unshakable belief that he was smarter than everyone else, that he could manipulate his way out of any reality, and that even captured he was still the one in control. The police had a man in custody, but they were beginning to realize that the mind they were trying to unlock was a prison far more complex and dangerous than any they could build for him. With Bundy in custody and a mountain of circumstantial evidence connecting him to crimes in multiple states, the system breathed a collective sigh of relief. The monster was in a cage. The legal process, slow but inexorable, began to grind forward. For the public and for law enforcement, the story was entering its final chapter, but they had fundamentally misunderstood their antagonist. They believed his weapon was the crowbar in his car. They had yet to learn that his true weapon was his mind, and it was a weapon he could use even from inside a prison cell. The charm that had failed him with seasoned detectives found new life within the very system designed to contain him. In Aspen, Colorado, facing charges for the murder of Karen Campbell, Bundy made a strategic decision. He would fire his lawyers and represent himself. This was not the act of a desperate man. It was a calculated move. As his own attorney, he was granted privileges other inmates were not. Access to the law library, and most critically, freedom from shackles and handcuffs while inside the courthouse. The system, with its rigid respect for legal procedure, saw a law student exercising his constitutional rights. Bundy saw a window of opportunity. On June 7, 1977, during a recess and a pretrial hearing, Bundy was left alone in the courthouse library. He was surrounded by books on legal precedent, a world he understood and respected. But he wasn't looking at the books. He was looking at the second-story window. In a single audacious moment, he jumped. He landed awkwardly, injuring his ankle, but he was free. The charming law student had simply walked out of his own trial. The escape triggered a massive manhunt, but it also triggered a wave of disbelief. How could this have happened? The answer was simple. The guards, the judge, the entire legal apparatus still saw him through the lens of their own expectations. He wasn't a rabid animal straining at his chains. He was Ted, the intelligent, well-behaved defendant. His rule had worked again. He had leveraged the system's perception of him as a civilized man to break free from its physical constraints. He was recaptured after 6 days, but the lesson was not learned. His second escape, 6 months later from the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, was even more audacious and revealed an even deeper systemic failure. Over several weeks, Bundy, the model prisoner, meticulously planned his next move. He starved himself, losing over 30 pounds so his body could fit through a small hole he was slowly sawing in the ceiling of his cell, a hole conveniently obscured by a pile of legal books. The guards saw a quiet, cooperative inmate who spent his days studying his case. They didn't see a predator patiently, methodically dismantling his cage from the inside. On a cold December night, while the guards were away for Christmas break, he slipped through the hole, crawled through the ceiling, and dropped into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening. He changed into the jailer's street clothes and simply walked out the front door into the snowy night. He was gone. These were not lucky breaks. They were systemic failures born directly from the power of Bundy's persona. He had so successfully sold the world the story of a respectable, intelligent man that even after he was a known, accused serial killer, the system couldn't fully shake its initial impression. They shackled his body, but they left his greatest weapon, their own underestimation of him, completely untouched. This second escape was a turning point. It was no longer just a failure of a few guards. It was an indictment of a system that could be charmed and manipulated by a convincing performance. The monster was loose again, not because the cage was weak, but because the zookeepers had been convinced the animal inside was tame. And this time, with his identity exposed and his back against the wall, he would drop the mask of civility for good, unleashing a final, horrific wave of violence. A fugitive cannot afford the luxury of a meticulous plan. The Ted Bundy who fled into the Colorado snow was a different creature from the one who had methodically stalked the Pacific Northwest. His face was now one of the most recognizable in America, plastered across newspapers and television screens. His greatest weapon, his anonymity and the charm it enabled, was gone forever. He was no longer a phantom blending into the crowd. He was a target, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous of all. He made his way east, a ghost drifting through the American heartland, finally landing in Tallahassee, Florida. He was drawn to the target-rich environment of Florida State University, a sprawling campus teeming with the very type of young woman he had always hunted. But here, he could no longer play the part of a helpful student or a concerned police officer. He was a nobody, a drifter living in a cheap rooming house near the campus, his identity a carefully guarded secret. The rule of assumed benevolence was no longer in his arsenal, and without it, all that remained was brute force and a deep, simmering rage. That rage exploded on the frigid night of January 15, 1978. The Chi Omega sorority house at FSU was a symbol of warmth, safety, and sisterhood. It was a home where dozens of young women slept, secure in the belief that the world outside could not touch them. In the span of just 15 minutes, Ted Bundy shattered that belief forever. The first police officer to arrive on the scene would later describe a silence that was heavier and more terrifying than any sound. The house was a scene of unbelievable chaos. It was not the work of a careful, organized predator. It was the work of a whirlwind. The attack was frenzied, disorganized, and marked by a level of violence that shocked even the most hardened investigators. "We need backup at the Chi Omega house, and send paramedics, multiple victims." Veteran detective, arriving on scene, voice low and grim. "What have we got?" Young officer. I don't even know how to describe it, sir. It's a slaughterhouse." This was the true face of Ted Bundy, stripped of his mask. The man who had once used charm and persuasion now used a heavy oak log to beat his victims. The meticulous planner who left no witnesses now left a scene so chaotic it screamed his identity. My analysis is that this was not a strategic attack. It was a psychological breakdown. It was an eruption of the pure narcissistic rage that had always festered beneath the surface. Having lost the ability to manipulate, he was reduced to the most primitive form of dominance, sheer, brutal violence. But in that frenzy, in that loss of control, He made the final, fatal mistake that would lead him to the electric chair. For years he had been a forensic ghost, leaving behind no fingerprints, no hair, no definitive proof that he was ever there. But in the chaos of the Chi Omega house, in the heat of his rage, he did something he had never done before. He bit one of his victims, Lisa Levy, with animalistic ferocity. He left a deep, distinctive double bite mark on her body. In the world of forensics, a bite mark is as unique as a fingerprint. It was a signature, written not in ink, but in flesh. It was the one piece of physical evidence that could be directly and irrefutably tied to him and him alone. The man who had built his entire criminal career on psychological manipulation and leaving no trace was about to be brought down by the most primal physical act imaginable. The rampage in Florida was a tragedy, but it was also a revelation. It was the terrifying, unvarnished truth of the man behind the mask. The rule of assumed benevolence was a tool he used when it suited him. When that tool was taken away, the world finally saw the monster that had been hiding in plain sight all along. A monster who was no longer a cunning phantom but a wounded, desperate animal, leaving a bloody trail that led directly to his own destruction. The bite mark was the nail in the coffin, the physical proof that science could not deny. But for Ted Bundy, the courtroom was not an endpoint. It was the grandest stage of his life. Facing the death penalty in Florida, he made a decision that baffled the legal world and captivated the nation. He would once again take the lead in his own defense. He fired his competent legal team in favor of the one person he truly trusted, himself. This was an act of supreme narcissism. In his mind, no one was smarter than Ted Bundy, and this trial was his opportunity to prove it to the world. He wasn't there to win an acquittal. He was there to perform, and for the first time in American history, the entire nation had a front-row seat. The Florida trial was the first to be nationally televised, gavel to gavel. The spectacle turned a grim legal proceeding into a national media circus. And at the center of it all was Bundy, the charming, confident, witty defendant playing the role of a lifetime. He seemed to relish the attention. He would cross-examine the very police officers who had hunted him, his questions calm, precise, almost academic. He would object to the prosecution's motions with a lawyerly confidence that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Watching the old news footage is a surreal experience. You see this handsome, intelligent man, and for a moment you forget you are watching a monster accused of unspeakable crimes. You are watching a star, prosecutor's voice, factual from archive footage. And officer, did you find any evidence of forced entry? Bundy's voice, cutting in, polite but firm. Objection, Your Honor. The question assumes a fact, not an evidence. He was brilliant. He was in his element. He was showing the world the man he always believed himself to be, a legal scholar, a respected authority, a man in control. He was using the rules of the court system, the very system designed to convict him as the final stage for his performance. But his masterpiece of manipulation, the single moment that would forever define the grotesque theater of this trial, came when his former girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, was on the witness stand. She had moved to Florida to support him, a testament to his enduring power to manipulate even those closest to him. While she was testifying as a character witness, Bundy saw an opportunity. Not a legal opportunity, but a theatrical one. Bundy's voice, from court recording questioning Boone. Carol, do you want to marry me? Carol Ann Boone's voice, surprised, emotional. I do. Bundy's voice, turning to the judge. And I want to marry you. And I do not say this lightly. I want to marry you. Judge's voice. Wait a minute. I now pronounce you man and wife. In that moment, the courtroom erupted. He had done it. He had hijacked his own capital murder trial and turned it into his wedding. It was an act of such audacious, narcissistic genius that it left everyone speechless. He wasn't a defendant fighting for his life. He was the groom, the star, the director of his own twisted theater. He had looked at the grim reality of his situation and decided to simply rewrite the script. My analysis of this moment is clear. This was not an act of love. It was an act of ultimate control. It was his final desperate attempt to deploy his rule. By proposing, he was trying to prove to the world and to himself that he was still the charming, desirable man, not the monster the prosecution described. He was trying to create a moment of human connection so powerful that it would momentarily erase the evidence of his inhumanity. The rule of his charm, the psychological weapon that made him a deadly weapon, had reached its final, most grotesque form. It was no longer a tool for luring victims or escaping jail. It had become a tool for celebrity, for cementing his own legend, ensuring that even in defeat the world would never, ever forget the name Ted Bundy. The wedding in the courtroom was the climax of the public spectacle. But after the cameras were turned off and the headlines faded, Ted Bundy was left with a stark, immutable reality, a 9-by-6-foot cell on Florida's death row. For a man whose entire existence was defined by his ability to control and manipulate, the ticking clock of a state-sanctioned execution was the ultimate loss of control. The charm had failed. The legal brilliance was irrelevant. The monster was caged and the end was certain. In those final days, with all appeals exhausted, he initiated his final gambit. He announced he was ready to talk. Not to beg for his life, but to finally, on his own terms, reveal the truth. His chosen audience was not a priest or a psychiatrist, but the men who had hunted him. FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier and Detective Bob Keppel. They were the only ones, he felt, who could truly appreciate the artistry of his crimes. He was not seeking absolution. He was seeking an audience for his life's work. The confessions that followed, recorded on scratchy audio tapes in the sterile quiet of a prison meeting room, are perhaps the most chilling documents in the annals of criminal psychology. Bundy did not weep. He did not express remorse. He recounted his murders with the cold, detached precision of a surgeon describing an operation. And he did it almost entirely in the third person. My analysis of these tapes suggests this was a final, brilliant psychological defense mechanism. By speaking of the killer as this individual or the entity, he could recount the most horrific details without ever having to emotionally connect with them. He became a consultant on his own life, a commentator on his own monstrosity. It was the ultimate act of narcissistic dissociation. Hagmaier's voice, calm, professional. So tell me about her, Ted, the girl in Utah. What was this individual thinking? Bundy's voice, thoughtful, unemotional, a dry rasp. You have to understand that at this point the entity's control was slipping. He wasn't just driven by the desire for possession anymore. The hunting was the primary thing. He would look for a specific type of victim, a representation of something he could never have. He saw her and he knew she was the one. The process itself was almost secondary to the possession of that individual. He wouldn't think of her as a person, more like a picture, an image he wanted to own. Listen to the language. The entity, the possession, an image. He is not describing the brutal murder of a human being. He is describing the acquisition of an object. This was not a confession born of guilt. It was a final desperate lecture from a man who believed his own twisted psyche was a subject worthy of academic study. He was explaining his rule one last time, not as a tool for manipulation, but as a force of nature that had consumed him. For hours, he detailed the fates of women whose families had waited years for answers. He guided investigators to remote locations in the mountains where he had left his victims, his memory for detail astonishing and horrifying. He was not giving them closure out of kindness. He was doing it as a final flex of his power. He was the one who held all the secrets, the one who knew where the bodies were buried. Even in his final moments facing his own mortality, he needed to be the one in control of the narrative. In the end, his confessions were his last and perhaps greatest performance. He was giving the world the monster it had always wanted, but he was doing it on his own terms, filtered through the lens of his own intellectual arrogance. He was the author, the narrator, and the subject of his own dark legend. He was ensuring that for decades to come, we would not just be horrified by his actions, but endlessly fascinated by his mind. That, for a narcissist like Ted Bundy, was the only kind of immortality that mattered. The morning of January 24, 1989, dawned cold and electric outside the Florida State Prison. A crowd had gathered in the pre-dawn darkness, a strange and unsettling mix of somber witnesses, death penalty protesters, and hundreds of people who were, for all intents and purposes, tailgating an execution. They held signs, they chanted, they set off fireworks when the official word came. As the final fatal charge of electricity surged through Ted Bundy's body, a primal roar of catharsis erupted from the crowd. The monster was dead, but a legacy is not a body. It cannot be killed and it cannot be buried. In the years I have spent studying this case, I have come to believe that Ted Bundy's true, lasting impact on America began only after his heart stopped beating. The cheers outside that prison were not just for justice. They were for the end of a long national nightmare. He had held the country hostage for over a decade, not just with his crimes, but with an idea. The idea that evil could look just like your friendly, helpful neighbor. His legacy within law enforcement was immediate and revolutionary. Before Bundy, the concept of a serial killer was a fringe academic term. He is the man who burned that phrase into the American consciousness. His case became the defining textbook for a fledgling, often dismissed unit within the FBI, the behavioral science unit. He was their Rosetta Stone. The interviews he gave, the patterns he left, the psychological games he played, it all became cold, hard data. They studied him, dissected his methods, and from the ashes of his crimes they began to build the modern science of criminal profiling. He taught them that motive was not always rational. It was not always about money or revenge or passion. Sometimes, for some people, the act of killing was the motive itself. He forced a generation of detectives to stop asking just, "Who did this?" and start asking the far more difficult question, "What kind of person does this?" But his most profound legacy was not left in the halls of the FBI. It was left in the minds of ordinary people. The rule of assumed benevolence, that unspoken social contract he had so masterfully exploited, was shattered forever. He was the serpent in America's garden, and after him no one looked at the apple the same way again. Think about it. Before Bundy, a woman whose car broke down might gratefully accept a ride from a charming stranger. A college student might not think twice about helping a handsome man with his arm in a sling. He took those simple acts of human kindness and twisted them into weapons of terror. He taught us that vulnerability could be a fatal condition. He forced a new, more paranoid rule upon our society, a rule that persists to this day. The rule of healthy suspicion. He is the reason parents began teaching their children about stranger danger with a new urgency. He is the reason a lone woman in a parking garage feels a spike of adrenaline when a van pulls up beside her. He didn't just kill the women whose names we know. He killed a part of America's innocence, a part of our willingness to trust one another without question. That is the true, enduring horror of Ted Bundy. His physical reign of terror ended in a flash of electricity, but his psychological reign continues. He became a ghost in the national machine, a permanent resident in our collective nightmares. He proved that the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones with claws and fangs, but the ones with a winning smile, a good education, and a deep understanding of the rules. His greatest, most enduring victim was not a person. It was our own collective sense of safety. So where does that leave us? Bundy is gone. The headlines have faded into history, but the weapon he perfected remains. It was never the crowbar, the handcuffs, or the pantyhose mask. His deadliest weapon was always the invisible one, the one he borrowed from society itself, the rule of assumed benevolence. He did not invent this weapon. He simply picked it up from where it was lying in plain sight, waiting to be used. He was a hacker of the human heart. He found a fundamental exploit in our social programming, our deep-seated instinctual need to trust, to help, to be kind. He understood that a handsome man with his arm in a fake sling is more disarming than a man with a gun. He knew that a polite, articulate man in a suit is more persuasive than a raving lunatic.
He didn't break down our doors.
He charmed us into opening them for him. And while Bundy himself is a ghost, the rule he mastered is more prevalent today than it was in the 1970s. In our modern world, the performance of normalcy has become an art form. We are surrounded by it every single day. It's in the curated, perfect lives we see on social media profiles. It's in the charming stranger we meet on a dating app. It's in the friendly face of a scammer offering a deal that seems too good to be true. The stage has gotten bigger, the masks have gotten better, and our desire to believe in the good and the normal is as strong as ever. We have, in many ways, become a nation of Carol DaRonches, constantly approached by strangers who seem trustworthy, who present a problem, and offer themselves as the immediate solution. The question is not whether we will be approached. The question is whether we will recognize the trap. The lesson from this entire tragic saga is not that we should become paranoid recluses, suspicious of every human interaction. That would be letting him win his final victory from beyond the grave. No, the lesson is far more nuanced and far more critical. It is a lesson in vigilance. It is the understanding that true evil rarely announces itself with a roar. It usually arrives with a polite request for help. It is the wisdom to know that the most important security system we have is not in our homes, but in our minds. The quiet, rational voice that is willing to question a perfect surface. The greatest lesson Ted Bundy ever taught us is not that monsters exist. It is that we are often the ones who hold the door open for them. The next time you are faced with a perfect smile, a flawless story, a disarming request for help, will you pause just for a second and ask the question he counted on you never asking? What is behind the mask? Because that is the one rule for survival that will never change.